Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar supported by Ultria, AI-led contract analytics. My name is Harry Bevan, and I'm a research analyst here at IACCM, and I would now like to hand over to our experts for today, Arthur Raguette and Paul Branch. Arthur, Paul, welcome, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Harry, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to those folks listening to this recording on our replay. Really exciting set of slides to share with you today. And as Harry said in the intro, AI-led contract analytics, a huge growth area. The application of technology in the contracting space, as I'm sure you've heard before, is something that's still relatively embryonic. So, you know, how we apply it, listening to experts in the field, as professionals, getting aware of how that technology can be best applied. That's really a key thing, a really key enabler for us to drive change in the discipline. I'm joined today by a friend and colleague from Ultria, Arthur Raguette. Art and I have worked together in multiple slots before. You may have seen us presenting in conferences together, and he is a star. He really does understand how this technology, artificial intelligence in general, works. But more importantly, I think how it supports the contract and commercial management discipline to do useful things for CCM practitioners. So we're going to talk a little bit about the technology, but more around the how it applies in the effective identification, management, and mitigation of contract risk, which we all know is a hugely important area. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk very briefly and share with you some insights based on the research that we've done at the IACCM. And then I'm going to hand over to Art, and he's going to run through a set of slides around a view of the emerging technologies, and then focus on this value. What is the value to contract management, and how artificial intelligence-led contract analytics can add value to that contract management activity? We're then going to provide you with some use cases. This is some work that Art and I have been working on collaboratively within a piece of work that is sponsored by the IACCM called the CLM Forum, the Contract Lifecycle Management Forum, where we've developed a number of use cases for folks to respond to. Once we've had a chance to share those use cases, indeed, what we'll do is Art will then craft and explain to you how those use cases can be delivered by the effective application of technology. Now, before I hand over to Art, though, I thought it'd be really useful to establish our starting point. Based on the research that we've done, and I'm pretty sure that the attendees on this call probably also follow the same pattern as our research. In our most recent research of over 500 organizations, we found that a shocking 64% of the respondees said that they do not have any meaningful automation that supports contract management. Hang on, Paul, we're talking here about complex analytics. So how on earth can we be getting into that high-end application when a large number of our membership are really struggling at the first steps in automation? The reason why we're so keen to share this technology with you is because it is an enabler to bypass a number of those steps in the process, to fast track your way through using the technology to pull out key elements of information. We call it metadata, key elements about your contract portfolio that enable you to do and respond in ways that, let's face it, you could not do in any way because of the human time and the nature of the extraction. You get the machine to do the heavy lifting for you. Gives you insights and analytics that you simply couldn't get through any sort of manual means. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact, though, that 64% is a telling indictment on our discipline. Why is that so high? There's several reasons that the research underpinned. Some suggest that folks have in fact made some investments, but those investments did not return what was intended, did not deliver the business case, and therefore the team was disappointed and did not see the business benefit. And others have simply not had the focus or stakeholder engagement to enable them to progress with any meaningful automation. An interesting stat for you. IACCM research suggests that we are going to replace at least half of the work that we are doing today as contract and commercial management professionals in the next 5 years. Is that a bad thing? Do you really want to spend your life writing out non-disclosure agreements? Do you really want to review order forms as a contract and commercial management professional? No is the answer. What we want to do is we want to start applying this technology as an enabler to move up that value add chain so that we can start adding more and more value as contract and commercial management professionals, taking us away from the nuts and bolts of the transaction into a piece that delivers material business benefits back to the corporation, such that the contract and commercial management profession is seen by the C-suite as being a key enabler for effective trading relationships, and is at the very heart, is the gearbox, if you like, to make all of those trading relationships work. That's where we need to get to, and that's what a large proportion of this technology application can actually do for us. That second stat there, 81% of the respondents indicate that they have or will now develop plans to implement, replace, or add to contract automation. So although we're starting off from a low base, the recognition is that that train is leaving the station, and we need to start seriously looking at how this technology can be deployed and what it can do to meet our growing business needs. Certainly the pandemic at its very start highlighted the need for effective portfolio analytics across your contract base. Simple questions like force majeure provisions or abandonment provisions were just the tip of the iceberg. Many corporations are now looking internally and saying, what tools do we need for this next crisis that's going to come along? We need to be able to be fleet of foot to enable us to do that complex analytics. Looking at the tools themselves, though, is just one part of a much more complex problem. If you look to the spider graph on the right-hand side, our maturity capability analysis that we perform here at the IACCM looks in fact at 9 dimensions, of which systems are just but one, to assess where a corporation or indeed a contract and commercial management activity fits within what is an industry benchmark, the little red line, the red line, and a world-class benchmark, the green line. So you can see that the organization here represented by the blue line has growth in all of those dimensions. It's my experience, and I'm sure Art will concur, that if you focus just on the systems piece, you're not going to be successful. You'll see benefit for sure, but you will not be successful in your strategic goal. What you have to do is focus on all of these dimensions, and I would pull out perhaps 2. You need to focus on people to make sure that the people are in the right, performing the right roles and have the right skills to be effective in those roles. And you need to focus on process. Are they fulfilling the right CLM process? And once you've got those people and process in place, are the tools supporting those other legs of the stool? The rest of it then will come together, because then you'll have a platform to enable you to drive forward strategic planning. You'll have a platform that's effective at doing obligations tracking and, as a consequence, risk management, as we're about to see. Art, before I hand over to you for the rest of the presentation, any thoughts on what I've said here today?
Well, certainly, Paul, I think two things jump out. One, your closing statement, that it's people and process, and maybe that third leg is platform that provides that stability for growth. It's interesting how technology, specifically analytics technology, can help those organizations at both ends of the maturity scale when it comes to the technology dimension. For those that are just getting started, and you had made this point earlier, which was the other reinforcement, sometimes analytics can help you get started. You can get information out of that morass of contract data or contract documents that are sitting in disparate environments to at least know where to start, or to help do some initial risk assessment, protection, maybe to even help your baseline definition for strategy. But certainly that's, for those folks who are in that 64% realm, probably a great way to begin that journey, versus those that are more established, more advanced, who are maybe looking to leverage more or to even recapture value that might have been wasted on false starts, as you had identified. Help those organizations further their goals. And drive additional value from their already important aspects of contract management when it comes to process and people. So, maybe that's a good segue to say, how can technology help organizations in a very practical way sort of move the ball forward, if you will.
Indeed.
So with that, let's go ahead and maybe take a look at contract analytics technology in light of maybe some current challenges to the contract process, and maybe even some aspect of the people side, and then maybe go into emerging technologies at a relatively survey level, and how this might be applied. And then, and by the way, I'm still blushing, Paul, from your comment that I'm a star. Really, I think our team has just been really, really good at deploying and architecting artificial intelligence solutions for the good of the customer. This is all about applied AI, practical AI, whether it's from a contract analytics or from a contract execution perspective. Otherwise, it's just really cool tech, but it's not going to help people with their day.
Totally, yeah.
So, there are some common challenges I think that we all recognize in the traditional contracting model. You've got multiple siloed business functions. You've got systems that are somewhat fragmented, especially in multinational organizations. And these could be something as simple as, well, legal has their particular store. Contracts team for procurement has their particular repository running around tied to a P2P. And those folks in temporary labor in HR have a totally different system altogether. That makes it relatively costly to manage and to govern across a number of disparate environments, which sometimes is just a good indicator of a very complex process or a series of complexes, rather a series of processes, easy for me to say. How do you get that metadata out of these contracts so that you can normalize information, that you can find things, that you can build a baseline so you know how you are improving? This all requires sometimes an inordinate amount of human process and people time. So the traditional contract management process can be cumbersome. Because it is a human-focused process, it's often error-prone. And it's certainly time that, based on IACCM resource, we can make better use of. So people tell us we're in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution. And really, it's a focus on digital technology and the application of digital technology as sort of the center of transforming everything we do today in business. But what do we mean when we talk about emerging technology? And I often get questions about what is or what is not artificial intelligence. So if we start with the baseline of AI, computers that try to discern, right? And this is really all about computer programs that try to discern information from what is fed to it. These are programs that are written by people, oftentimes your data scientists, some very, very smart folks, but it makes it very difficult to adjust or to train or to configure an artificial intelligence engine. This is where we look at machine learning as sort of a derivative or a component of the AI landscaping. And what machine learning means, in very simple or very straightforward terms, is that the software application or the engine learns by observation of human interaction with the program, or through something like deep learning, mines and reviews heritage or legacy large data sets to determine likely outcome from source information. Machine learning, when done properly, allows citizen scientists, subject matter experts in our world, contract negotiators, contract managers, contract professionals, to effectively provide input into the artificial intelligence engine through machine learning in a human interface kind of way. And I'll show you some examples today. And then on the back end, within the AI engine, that makes adjustments to things like semantic analysis and natural language processing, so that end user subject matter experts have the ability to configure artificial intelligence in real time to adapt and to drive the change that's required to help not just themselves but other non-legal human teams understand the nuances of contract language. To be able to extract data elements, no matter how deeply buried or spread out, or occasionally hidden from the normal reviewer they may be. And then to normalize that information and to provide insightful, actionable information to key stakeholders, ultimately to affect how business is run. How to be more resilient in a recessive economy, how to be more agile in your supply chain, how to identify risks, whether it be on the demand side or the supply side, and how to leverage the technology to go beyond just scanning legacy contracts, but to help you move the dial in your business today.
Hey, I know we're going to get in this in a bit later, but it's that feedback loop that I think many solutions struggle with to enable the learning to actually then improve how the extraction works. It is my personal experience that many of these AI platforms out of the box perform very poorly. It's only when they are trained with a material number of samples to hone a particular provision that is favored by a particular corporation that they then return a satisfactory level of precision and recall. Precision being how accurate it is, and recall being how complete it is. Is that consistent with your experience?
In some ways, yes, but I think we may have progressed sort of that second generation at this point. The precision and accuracy, being able to identify things that I've seen that are similar and being able to come up with high accuracy levels. The accuracies in the upper 80s to low 90% ranges is what we're seeing today, but we're seeing that today almost coming, I don't want to say out of the box, but with a relatively short training cycle. Mm-hmm. Contracts across domains, across industries, across geographies are fundamentally very similar. And I know people are already starting to raise their eyebrows or crinkle their nose, and there's probably hate messages coming across the Q&A tab right now. But we often see limitation of liability. There's only so many ways that we can phrase that, or indemnification, inbound, outbound. These are somewhat fixed in the parameterization. If you run a couple of million contracts through an AI engine, it gets pretty smart and pretty generically aware. And our particular model has been not to share any particular customer's patterns with any other customer, but to use the similar patterns, or the similar, if not generic patterns, across our customer base, and the idea that all boats rise with the tide. That
Sure.
enables us, and I'll use your example, Paul, of maybe a provision that's specific to a particular company in a particular industry, that with a small sample, 20 to 30 contracts that have that provision or some derivative, ideally some derivative, within that very, very small training set, we can train or provide that feedback literally within 24 hours. And to simply...
That is pretty cool, isn't it? That's a major step forward.
Oh, it's a huge leap. Not to call out names, but we recently had a customer who talked about running an audit against 150,000 agreements to his internal team, and he found a 94% accuracy in the results. We used 12 contracts to do that tuning. And again, not trying to tout our own horn, but it's come a long way. If you and I were talking a year ago, I think as we might have, we were talking about having 1,000 contracts or 1,500 contracts as a baseline training set. Now it's become so much less. And the other, I think, and we'll see some examples, is putting the training in the hands of the professional user, not in the hands of our technical or engineering team.
Right.
That's the big stuff, I think.
We've got some questions coming in. Togi has asked more of a statement. Can we? We're going to get to this, but he's prompting for some more practical examples, and I think when we get into our use cases, we'll be able to provide those. So,
practical examples with screenshots coming your way.
Perfect. Let's keep cracking.
Perfect, and a good motivation for me not to get stalled on this slide. Some things that you'll find with contract analytics technology that are powered by AI engines. It self-learns. So not only can it be trained, which is sort of item 4 here, intelligent, trainable, embedded, but also that it can mine. So you can leverage a deep learning approach through an existing contract repository and have it sort of drive, hey, these are some of the things that seem to be consistent, and using both AI core and semantic processing to identify those things, and then machine learning to reinforce positive behavior, or to negate or to back out negative behavior, doubles the speed at which you can improve your models. And it's an absolutely appropriate way. And I think as you'll see some screenshots in the next few screens, it's meant to be easy. It's actually very hard to build easy to use software, as any technologist will tell you, but it's the right way to ensure scalable deployment. Scalability is not just about the ability to run tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of agreements through your engine. It's about making sure that someone in procurement or sourcing or sales operations or financial risk analysis can interact with that platform from a business user's perspective, not from a coding or an API perspective. So how does AI-powered analytics add value to the contract process? I mean, just sort of walk through, and this is probably that use case for the 64% of respondents from your original slide, Paul, that said they haven't really put anything together yet. You can start off by just pointing the system towards your contracts. They don't have to be inside of a CLM or a content management platform or a document management system, but the ability to have software read through these loose files, convert them into something consistent, and then effectively disassemble them, normalize data, extract and identify clauses, and then create an output file that can be analyzed, shared, visualized, in a way that can be easily consumed by your legal teams, your sourcing and procurement teams, sales ops, finance, IT service providers, whatever the case may be. This is the easiest way to leverage analytics prior to having all of the information governance that you associate with a contract lifecycle solution. And
yeah,
if you do have multiple pockets,
this is the point I was making before, Art, where I think you can use the analytics capability as a triage for an unstructured document set. So if I've been through this process a few times now, but if I was from a green field with nothing in my CLM tool, I would be tempted to first analyze them using this approach you've just outlined, so that you can get to the metadata to understand your data structures, to understand how your documents should be organized in your CLM tool, and then use the metadata to populate the CLM tool so that it has that the ability to structure your contract data, your clause library, your fallback provisions, using the technology to pull out what they should be, rather than have to engineer that from scratch. Does that make sense?
Makes absolute sense. So this is a way to get jump started and to really advance first, and then bring the additional processes along with you as you go. And I think as people have started to learn how to react to things like the most recent pandemic, getting started is key.
Sure. Do you want to touch a little bit on this scenario here, for where documents are, as in many cases, in a filing cabinet? Well, you can't get to them electronically, obviously, but if they're in a scanned form, so they've gone through a photocopier and that's all that folks have, they have an electronically stored but not searchable form. How do they get past that first step?
I'm actually going to show a couple of, that's part of our use case. Actually, it's use case 3. So we can park that for a minute. I'll get to that in about 5.
Excellent. We'll come back. That's one of the questions that came in just now. Thank you.
Oh, no, and that is a great question. So, yeah, we'll actually walk you through that example. So, and maybe we'll just touch on that as we go through some of these slides, in terms of having a robust framework to begin with, and then leveraging analytics on top of it, versus using analytics to really build out your process, to help identify how you want to deploy your human resources to get to the same goals. To your point, Paul, how do you triage the current as-is scenario? This enables you to either integrate into your CLM strategy, or to start off just from the straight DMS. And let's sort of move forward to that. So as promised, I've got 3 case studies that our teams put together from sort of real world. The names have been changed to protect the innocent or the guilty, as the case may be. As we sort of go through here, I will certainly look forward to any questions that might come up. So let's take the first one here, a risk obligation identification and penalty avoidance. That is like the big hammer. So we've got a lot to accomplish here. But fundamentally, if I have a handle on where my contracts are, and let's just put this in maybe a pandemic kind of environment. I'm looking to manage my cash flow as much as possible. I want to delay payments to my suppliers. I may want to reduce any existing orders that I have outstanding, or I may want to freeze or pause supplier relationships. Not a big fan of canceling, but okay to put them on hold short time. But then in the same breath, I want to make sure that those suppliers I maintain relationships with, that I get a sense of, will they be able to satisfy their performance obligations to me? I think this is a fairly realistic use case, albeit multi-pronged. So I'm looking to understand, what contracts can I get out of? What are my obligations to my suppliers? I also want to understand what obligations my suppliers may have to me in terms of, lack of abandonment, or whether there are specific force majeure outs and the like. And I want to be able to do this fairly quickly. So the use case is that I want to be able to pull together information from different documents and from different places within sort of these agreement bundles, which is a very real world kind of thing. And I want to identify straightforward things: payment terms, service level agreements, KPIs, rebates, milestones. What are my obligations on pausing? And then are there triggers and data that sort of will impact or execute a trigger that I want to be able to bring back into my CM or my CLM to prevent me from going into a default or a risk or a penalty situation later? So to do that, and as we walk through this, picture, if you will, 100 contracts or 7 contracts or 1,000 contracts, and these could be sitting in a SharePoint drive someplace, or a thumb drive, cloud somewhere else. But bring in individual files. This happens to be a PDF image file, not uncommon for a lot of you. And the software converts the image file to a readable docx file through a use of combined OCR, optical character recognition, and natural language processing that corrects for common errors. And by generating this docx file, it is now machine searchable. So Paul, you had mentioned that the question came up about image files that were not searchable nor indexable. I've now converted this image to a text searchable, free text by the way, and also extracted 40 out of 54 common metadata elements, as we can see in this third column, from a 63-page contract. Now, what does that look like? Well, here we have clauses that have been identified out of that 63-pager. And we've got, thankfully, I'll say, paragraph titles, and sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Plus also the metadata embedded within the agreement or bundle of agreements has been extracted. Now, if I sort of page down to the second set within this particular document, I can see that the, paragraph number 14, delivery of goods, maps over to some pre-existing clause types. Now, these are clause types that we know about, or that a customer may know about, and we'll even get into how customers might be able to add, new, clause types. What this enables you to do is on a very, high rate of speed, a very high volume, identify where certain clause language exists within each of these contracts. And notice that this is showing us a percentage match for this particular paragraph, delivery of goods, into specific contract clauses. In this case, 62.77% match to contract obligations. This is where the payment information was actually embedded within this particular doc, and it came across, let me see, page 1, good to have it up front, page 26, tied to service level definitions, and then payment milestones and SLAs linked together and buried on page 51. This is what software is really good for, being able to determine, and notice that none of this looks like an exact text match. This is not search. This is reading, understanding, mapping your understanding to an outline construct, right? This is what analytics is about. Once you have this information, the ability to now tag it, create events, being able to trigger alerts to ensure that if you've got a particular SLA level or you have a particular payment date in mind, that your information governance is simply allocated. This, of course, within a CLM, it could just as easily have been a calendar invite to, Susan in accounting to remember to get an invoice off before the 3rd of the month. Actual deliverables and milestones can be extracted in terms of obligations and mapped within your contract platform, providing that you're running one. And this enables you to have both a level of milestone tracking, obligation mapping, and as you can see from the screen, reminders and notifications to any party involved with that obligation. And I like this one, repeat notification every second day. the system is going to yell at you every other day, you will eventually take care of that. But this is just practical use of the results of analytics being plugged into either post-obligation milestone tracking, post-execution milestone tracking, and or event notification and alerts.
So Art, we've got a couple of questions on that have come in on that particularly. First question is around, you use the word understanding. The tool needs to understand the contract form. Is it truly understanding, or is it just very sophisticated pattern matching? Which one is it?
That's great. It goes beyond pattern matching. So without divulging too much of the internals, it is, in fact, mapping the intent of the text with the intent of what you were looking for. So it's not doing a character match or partial word or string or, hey, these three words are close to each other. You know, that's one of three engines that are used to get the data out of the platform correctly. So semantics and NLP is really one. The other is sort of a more contextual and structural analysis. And then our generational jump, how we went from Gen 1 to Gen 2, was really getting our arms around how to measure the intent of the words themselves. So it is more than pattern match. I'm not saying that this is the same as going to a therapist who understands you. Yeah, but there is a level of interpretation that goes well beyond what you could train a dog to do.
So Togi asks, he's been very active asking a lot of questions. Will there be a contract owner human to verify the extraction, analysis, and insights that the tool has delivered?
Yes, and I will show you screenshots of that as well, plus the ability to interact with the tool and tell it to go find some new things for you.
Very good. And Heather has asked a question about language. Does every language need to be trained independently, or is the tool language independent?
Great question. So, for instance, our CLM platform is fairly broad in terms of language. Our analytics platform, when it comes to doing this kind of interpretive searching, is very much language dependent. To some degree, it is also sort of frame of law dependent, right? But generally, language is the limiter. So British English, American English, even Canadian English, pretty darn similar. International English, of course, part of that. Once we get into other languages, they have to be trained individually.
Right. Gotcha.
The next question that she's probably, or he may be asking is how many contracts? We can train a new language with about 600 to 700 contracts.
Wow. That's certainly come down since the last time I looked.
The biggest difference, again, I think is one, our ability to run the understanding of intent. But the other is, as long as you can identify fundamentally the paragraph type, you can accelerate the training. So I would look at payment versus, let's say, limitation liability. If I've got some level of framework, that's great. Gotcha. One thing we can't do, and everyone always asks, is you can't do live translation. No offense to our friends at Google, but Google Translate on a contract just does not work. Right? We all know that it has to be much more advanced than that.
Indeed. There's stacks of questions coming in, but let's press on. We'll get to them at the end, I hope.
Yep, no, fair enough. So use case 2, merger and acquisition support. It's always better to be on the merger side than the acquisition side. But let's just take a quick use case here. 2 companies. I call them M and A because I'm not very creative. So organization M has agreed to acquire A. As part of this process, they need to do a due diligence on A's contracts. So, in the real world, this could be making sure that the contracts that company A has on their revenue side don't have easy outs, that there's no termination for convenience, that force majeure is well defined, that there's no way that their customers could abandon, those kinds of commits, that it's long-term, non-refutable. Likewise, you want to take a look at maybe company A's supply chain. Make sure that their key, their direct material suppliers can't back out, that their service providers have SLAs, that their KPIs are crossed to ensure prompt payment, and appropriate payment across the board. So here you may also have a large volume of contracts and you have no system whatsoever. This is really similar to that scenario of 64% of your users, except in this case, they're not your contracts to begin with. So you have no real background, you've got no metadata coming in. They're going to give you a thumb drive or a glorified FTP location. So here you want to be able to take any source of data. Could be image, could be PDF image, could be text, could be PDF searchable, everything except for stuck in a filing cabinet or a banker's box. Be able to intake this, identify common risks, both on the sort of sell side contract, but also buy side or supply chain side contracts. And then identify things that are materially different between key clauses and your own playbook. Not that it's going to change how you structure your deal, but at least you're coming in with eyes wide open. Now, the same thing could happen just in a consolidation. You've got multiple businesses being brought together. I think this is a fairly universal use case where people are going to give me a large brown bag with a bunch of contracts in it, and we need to make heads or tails to make sure that we're heading in the right direction. So here we take a batch of agreements coming in for any particular type, create a simple batch, define the risk model. So risk models are nothing more than a combination of risk factors, and you can make these up as you go. We'll sort of show how that happens, and simply run your batch of contracts or agreements or documents through the risk model. Get a visual scorecard in terms of where you have positive and negative matches on a contract by contract level, and be able to dive in to any specific contract and see where these risk areas are. And again, this is far beyond a simple pattern match to find jurisdiction, right? Being able to identify different patterns for a particular risk factor is default within the tool. So here I've got 15 distinct limitation of liability patterns across and buried within indemnification clauses we see all the time. Now, if I look at a particular contract and a particular paragraph, I don't like to use the word clause because to me, clause means clause from clause library, clause from playbook. But if we look at incoming information labeled or tagged or grouped as a paragraph, we can then see what the percentage of match is to your playbook's version of the clause. If I had a playbook that had my preferred, my alternate 1, my alternate 2, and my default, each of those would show here in this middle panel. I think my mouse is visible, right? Will show you your match against those preferred and the derivatives. Now, in the real-time mode, if this was bolted into your document platform or bolted into the Ultria CLM, you could then route reviews automatically based on how close or how far away key paragraphs match to your clause or your playbook. So triage on intake as well as triage during analytics. Once you know what those are, the ability to then be able to sort of run those through. And in this particular example, we're seeing, how many different risk factors are in each of these contracts. If you started to see a pattern, in this case, again, I'm doing an M&A, I see an awful lot of arbitration clauses as compared to jurisdiction governance kind of clauses. Okay, maybe what I want to do is add a new risk factor for arbitration, specifically with the American Arbitration Association in Los Angeles, as compared to the International Arbitration Association in Geneva. I very simply highlight the text and then add a new risk factor. Apply the name, tell it to create, and then have it run against that entire legacy or heritage set of contracts. And the more arbitration examples I give it, and I think we saw an example before of 15 LOL, limitation liability. If I throw it 3, 4, or 5 from my set here, and this is all being done by a contract professional, not an IT guy, right? Not a vendor, not a partner, but end user, I will then get the same results for, in this case, an arbitration-related risk factor. Before we move on to the simplest example, just in terms of straight file load and metadata extraction, any questions on the risk factor side of things, Paul?
Yeah, there's a question that came in from Rod, one of our regular listeners. Rod asks, for the M&A activity, do you find that many major law firms that support these activities provide this service as part of their support? If not, are they pursuing it? So are the legal beavers looking at this as a sales opportunity?
I think to some degree that they are. I mean, if I think about the AmLaw 100, just very much a U.S. focus. Sorry about that. I'm probably going to say 20% of the top 100 have practices in this area, and they've got some level of discovery. I think that many law firms, no disrespect to that particular segment of the industry, they tend to make their money based on billable hours on partners. So they may offer or have technology, but it's not going to be something you're going to see on an invoice. I do think that we are seeing legal services organizations, sort of parallels to big law, that they will begin to do more of this probably in the next 12 months.
Yeah, so
we've all heard about
process outsourcers, those sorts of things, those sorts of guys, the growth in, I think you were going to say the Deloitte progress.
There you go.
Yeah, no, agreed.
Right, so whether it's Elevate or folks over at HBR, I mean, we all sort of have those folks who do legal process or outsourcing can support this. I find, and maybe it's just bias, companies who are highly acquisitive should have this in-house. I realize that's probably a very small population of our universe, but folks who are either consistently doing roll-ups, or if you're just doing due diligence on distributors or franchisees, and you've got right to audit, it's a great thing to do.
Indeed. Okay, use case number 3.
Okay, so contract discovery, this is our last use case, and I'll try to walk through this a little bit. I think I have time to do it right. So this is really quite simple. This is your definition of the 64% that don't have a system. So we have our mythical corporation. They do not currently have a database that contains all of their updated contracts. They need to gather it all, put it into one place. In order to evaluate, in this case, let's use the supplier portfolio example. They're trying to understand, when do my contracts expire? Do they automatically renew? Are there SLAs? What base obligations do I have? So this is really about being able to load up contracts and run through that same conversion from image to text, and then extract metadata. So I think you had raised a question earlier, Paul, from one of our listeners, saying, is there a human interface for someone to validate and verify? So here we've extracted a number of metadata elements, and if I scroll down a little bit, we'll notice that laws of the state of California has been extracted, and then it has been sort of updated by the user to capitalize the L. If likewise I simply wanted to say governing law California, I can simply backspace over laws of the state, and then when I'm ready, I can hit the blue approve button in the upper right-hand side of the screen, and that learning will be fed directly to the engine if it was an authorized user. And I say if it was an authorized user, and maybe I'm giving too long of an answer for the simple question earlier, but let's say I'm a good guy, I know my way around a contract, I know what governing law should look like or jurisdiction. Maybe my changes are fed directly back into the learning set for the engine. But maybe I have an outside LPO that's going to help me do a contract load of some sort, and I want to check their work. All right. Their corrections can be sent to me I can then review them, and then my review can be sent to the engine. This is a very straightforward, very clean UI that enables people to very quickly capture, amend, correct, or even populate data when you're looking to create an organized contract structure. This is sort of the ultimate first pass triage. Go through all my contracts, find out which ones are active, find out which ones have not expired. I mean, here we just have your renewal dates. Flag for me which ones are auto-renewal so they don't happen automatically. I want someone to look at these first, right? This is the information I need to get going. And then if I go a little bit farther, then maybe I'm capturing limitation of liability clause data and capturing the actual text, because there's a handful of clauses that matter a lot to me. That text can be captured, stored as metadata, which then makes it reportable and exportable. So not that I'm saying you do this on a shoestring, right? But if I'm looking to get started, this is a way for me to organize my contracts, my agreements, prioritize, triage who should be doing what, and then putting this information together for visualization, further analytics, or just loading up into an index file so I can find things. So we've got about 5 minutes. I have maybe way too much content left that just talks a little bit about the benefits to legal operations, procurement, M&A teams, sales, finance and risk, which I'm happy to, we'll include in the leave behind deck. But Paul, are there other questions that are outstanding right now?
Yeah, we've got a couple of meaty ones. So it was John who raised the issue of APIs, the interfaces between systems.
Yeah.
What we're seeing, certainly based on our research, we've seen that we're moving away now from being able to manage a system just within itself. It needs to work not only with systems within the enterprise, but it needs to extend beyond the enterprise into the ecosystem. So these APIs, these programmable interfaces, are critical components to enable these tools to work well together. John's example was a VDR, a virtual data room, where his experience was that another platform had an API into this data room to enable M&A activity to proceed and the analysis to proceed.
Perfect.
Does your tool have APIs that enable that sort of integration?
Both our CLM and our contract analytics platform are both fully API enabled. So I showed an example of, I think, data being pushed out. Let me see, here we go. Through a spreadsheet. The same output could simply dump or does dump out to an XML file. So at the risk of getting into the tech weeds, you can send information into the Orbit AI platform programmatically, and it can come in real time, get processed, and return back. Or you can run batches from either, I like the idea of a virtual data room, but I could be running off of a large data stack, a simple SFTP or mount, a SharePoint mount, could be a data lake as a spin out from a big data archive, and have the tool basically digest or ingest contract information and then spit out the results. If you are looking at taking this as part of a matter management or other sort of contract management platform, similarly, direct API access, absolutely.
Good. Jean-Louis asked a while ago, for contracts that are in the EPC space, the engineering, procurement and construction industry area, have you got experience of this sort of technology working well in that space?
From an analytics perspective, absolutely. From a contract authoring perspective, EPC is a little tricky because one of the expectations is people oftentimes want to go beyond the contract into contractor performance and even into milestone-based trigger payments. But from a pure analytics perspective, yes, you want to be able to go beyond the SOW, you want to go beyond the equivalent of the AIA spec, and be able to extract key milestones, deliverables, obligations. Everything works fine. Just don't have an expectation that you're trying to extract information out of engineering drawings. That is still an area that almost any technology provider can be challenged with.
So that's a good point. So engineering drawings are tough. What about something more standard though, things like tables? In my experience, getting a machine to understand and interpret a table in a contract, which happens quite frequently, is
Yes.
actually quite hard. Is that still the case?
It is very much the case. What I find, or what we find as a company or as a technology provider, is if you have consistent tables, then this conversion and the scraping is very much possible. Otherwise, you simply need to set rules. And what I mean by rules are, if I'm going to interpret the contents of, let's say, a price list that is in a table, do I go across the top and then down? Do I go down and then across the top? How do I build the array?
Mm.
And that is something that we generally reserve for our technology team. That is not a end user build a risk factor. That is, reach out to your support guys, tell me that you've got 400 contracts in a company you're going to buy, and you want us to rip those tables apart. We will adjust the engine and then let you go ahead and run it against those 400 contracts.
Sure.
So we don't have to do it as a service, but we do have to configure it for the read. And that is, I think, a fairly common approach. And really, that is all. The only reason is, do I go down and across or across and down? I know it sounds like a simple decision, but you can't do both.
So I think it's an allied question from Heather asking, is there any limitation on the number of metadata fields that can be extracted?
Patience. That's the only real limitation. No, and I'm sorry for the convoluted answer. We have customers who are doing 119 to 127 metadata elements. And for metadata extraction, it's pretty straightforward. When we look at risk factors, that's where you need to be a little bit more patient. Metadata is a little easier to find. Risk factors, because of the interpretation of the text and its content, requires an incremental read. So I'd probably put some comfortable cap at about 100 risk factors would be my my gut check before you have to start running things overnight.
Gotcha. Right. Well, Art, we have a number of questions that unfortunately we haven't had time to get to today. And I think we could talk about this for basically all day if we wanted to, but we don't have the time, and we need to recognize that folks are time limited as always. So it remains for me to say thank you to our audience for asking such great questions, really live discussion. And most importantly, Art, for me to say thank you to you for what was a fantastic presentation and a really live and interesting debate that I thoroughly enjoyed. So thank you so much for that, Art.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for your support and for, again, the lively debate. Speaking of lively debates, it's both of our chances to sort of plug the upcoming Emerging Technologies Workshop at the Vibe Summit 2020.
Absolutely, be there or be square. There are a number of really exciting workshops, and as Art shared, he and I are working a workshop jointly. It's building on the success that we had at our conference last year. So Vibe Summit coming to it 21st of September. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, don't miss it. It will be a great opportunity. And of course, our workshop will be the best, but you know, that's up for grabs.
Oh no, oh definitely, it'll be the best. Paul, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. And certainly to all of our listeners and participants, thank you very much.
And do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much indeed. Take care. Bye-bye.